away at the higher level. But that is wrong. I think fundamentally we need to think about respect and dignity of people. Those who are working in the trenches, those who do the work, we need to promote them and recognize them, because then they are empowered to do more for the organization. And it's a difficult thing to practice, but one need to start. And the whole idea is, if we continue the same path others are following, if it's the wrong path, we are not going to get good results. Let's go to the next question.
Yeah, so the next question, Dr. Vito asks that will emotion make you a weak leader?
So the question is, will the emotion make you a weak leader? No, absolutely not. So we talked about emotional intelligence, right? So leaders need to empathize with their people, understand their background, and the role of the leader is to become a coach, not try to just become a boss by treating people as a number only. So if you take time out to understand where each of the people who are working in your area, direct support, what is their background, what is their perspective, where they come from, what are their strengths. Here we can learn from the theory of strengths, work done by the Gallup organization, Strengths Finder 2.0, find out who is good at what. Once you know that, when the team assignments are being made, we can ask for volunteers, as well as look to align the strengths of the person with the assignment you are giving to them, the task or a subtask. So it's extremely important to have the emotions, because without emotions, you become a robot. So we do not want robotic leadership, right? Robot can do a lot of things, but they can't think. They cannot display the emotions. If we have the robotic leaders, that whole organization will be like zombies. Next.
Yeah, Ms. Seema asks, is extroversion a necessary trait of leadership?
Absolutely not. There are wonderful leaders who are introvert. They do work in a quiet fashion behind the scene, and they accomplish the objectives. So the way to look for the success of the leader is, what is the objective given to that person? What are the resources assigned to that person? And are they able to achieve the results using the resources in the time frame? So in the project management sense, are they able to deliver on time, within budget, and meeting all the performance requirements? So extroversion, if you are extrovert, fine, but that's not the necessary thing. You could be introvert, but could be a great leader.
Okay, there's another question by Ms. Seema, and she asks, should we ignore non-performers in a team?
Not at all. So I think here I would suggest reading up on the 5 dysfunctions of a team. This is a book by Patrick Lencioni. Wonderful book written. It's a leadership fable, and this puts the focus on the team leader, where when the team is being chartered, the leader has to assemble the team and ensure that none of the dysfunctions are present. So accountability, trust, then commitment, and all those things needs to be tested. And if any of the dysfunctions are present, you need to remove them. Secondly, non-performers. The team leader is to sit down with that person and ask the question, what is coming in the way for them to perform? Secondly, are there any personal issues coming in the way? So give them little time and space to solve that issues for themselves. But give very clear expectation that you expect the results for the benefit of the team and benefit of the organization. And if they do not perform, and if you have a choice, put them out of the team and bring new people who could be more useful to bring the good results.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Finu Jose, she asked, traditionally, leadership is aligned to titles. I know some amazing colleagues who inspire other peers to publish and write, but are questioned about lack of leadership position. Would you suggest what would you suggest for such people to stay motivated, or what can we do to help these selfless individuals feel good?
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a wonderful question. What happens is there are people who do not do much work, but they take the credit and try to promote themselves. So loudmouth carried the day versus the silent workers who are adding great values, helping others, etc. They get ignored. And specifically, I could say that personally, I went through similar journey in the large corporation. It takes a while before top leaders will recognize your value and promote you to the next level, etc. But in my way of thinking is, and I'll give you my example where I saw the difference, that if you have a subject knowledge, ownership, the leadership, you know your subject well, you are master at it, people will come to you no matter what position you are holding in the organization. So I was specializing in quality management discipline. I was one of the pioneer at our campus of 10,000 plus people at AT&T Bell Labs here in Naperville, Illinois. So when some of the quality issues were coming up, customer dissatisfaction, etc., even the senior vice president would call me and ask me for my opinion, what direction we should be going. I was at the engineer level. Think of it this way, 5 levels above, person makes a call to find out what can be done. So the knowledge is power. And this is our own obligation that we need to be master at what we do. Learn a lot of things, be the lifelong students, continue to amass the knowledge, and that knowledge nobody can take away. And those positions are fleeting. You could be a department head now, but time comes, you will be asked to step down and take other positions or whatever. But whatever knowledge you have accumulated, that is your knowledge, and nobody can take it away from you. Kindly, everybody stay muted, please. Thank you. Go ahead, Silpiji.
Yeah, so the next question is from Ms. Harita Shri. She asks, what is over supervision in your view as a leader? How will it affect an employee or a team member?
Yeah. So we need to think about macro management, not micromanagement. So if we do micromanagement, people get frustrated because what we want is, first of all, you've gotten the good people in your team, in the organization. You need to trust them. You need to give them the major guidelines, what is expected of them, and then let them use their creativity and talent to find the solution. You provide all the resources and don't tell them what to do step by step, because that is not very good in terms of empowering them. So I'll leave it at that. Macromanagement should be the focus because it frustrates the people when you do micromanagement over supervision and you are wasting your time. You could be doing more productive work rather than micromanaging your people.
There's a question that Dr. Ijaz Ahmed is asking. He's asking, how can a disciplined officer deal with political masters' interference while implementing a well thought decision which would be in interest of the society?
Yeah, I think one has to keep, okay. Can I request everybody to be on a mute? I hear a lot of disturbance. Please be mindful of helping others as well together. Thank you. Yeah, could you please quickly give the sense of the question because a little bit I'm not very clear.
So, the Dr. Ijaz Ahmed asks that there's a disciplined officer, and he has to deal with a political master's interference while implementing a well thought decision, which would be very, very beneficial to the society. So, how can he deal with that interference of political masters? Like we can say that politicians, when they interfere with the working of the officers, how can
Yeah.
you deal with such a situation?
Yeah, I think this is again a critical issue, particularly at the India scene. We have seen political people, and pardon me, some of them may not have the enough knowledge. They just put their finger in everything and they try to dictate what needs to be done, which is unfortunate. See, even as a politician, if you want to be a good leader, you need to trust your people, find the right people, then trust them and allow them to use their judgment to carry out the directions you are trying to give them. If you interfere in the right course of action, you as a leader or a politician are doing a disservice and putting your people at risk, because people are caught in a dilemma. They want to do the right things. However, the politicians are interfering. And this is a tragedy for the education system in India, if I can put it mildly. You look at the appointments being made, whether you are competent or not, you become the head of the institute. And with all the things happening in a vertical fashion, even small little details has to be filtered through the head of the institute. And if that person is not capable, think of the consequences and the damage is being done to the institute. And I could cite many examples. I don't want to give any names here, but there are many, many institutes where incompetent people are occupying the positions and they are ruining those educational institutes. They are also doing disservice to the faculties, to the students, by not having them to excel in what resources they are given. And I'm talking about centrally run universities included in this, IITs, NITs, etc. So sorry to say, but that's a sad state of affair in India.
Thank you, sir. So there's a question by Dr. Prabhu Shankar. He asks, in your perception, which leader in the world has successfully mitigated the COVID crisis?
Yeah, so I think the examples are fairly clear. You look at New Zealand, Australia, then Singapore, and South Korea. Those leaders understood the gravity of situation very early on. They took the right measures and kept the country relatively safe compared to other countries. And of course, they have to go through ups and downs as well, second wave, third wave, etc. But on the opposite end, you look at Brazil, United States, we paid a heavy price here. Almost 600,000 people, 6 lakh people perished in the US, because in the early times, the warnings were not heeded well and took it lightly. The prep time for about 5 to 6 weeks was lost. And then it came and struck us very hard, and we had several lockdowns. And finally, with the vaccine distribution, things are turning around and economy is opening up and things are getting better. But smaller countries like New Zealand, Singapore, etc., they have done superb job because they had the great leaders who took the lead and did the right things by listening to the scientists and the experts, unlike here where the previous president did not want to listen to the scientist. So that is where the leadership plays a big role in the crisis situation like COVID.
Thank you, sir. So we'll take only two more questions because there are a lot of questions, but we will take two more questions. So the second last question is, how do you differentiate a corporate leader and an educational leader? The difference between a corporate leader and educational leader.
I think both of them, you can look at it from the perspective of what they have achieved for the organization and what they have contributed for the sustainability of the organization. And then you could see the results and you can put them in parallel. The scales will be different because at a corporate level, they may be working with the huge amount of capital and they may have more resources. At the educational institute, at the same time, you can look at their fundamental contributions, how well they shape the institute to take it forward so that it becomes better than where they were given the charge to lead it. So that's where I would leave it. And The last question, please.
Yeah, so the last question is by Miss Rachna, sorry. She asks that in today's world, we are showing work being done against actual work done. So there is a lot of gossip and backbiting. How does one handle this as a leader?
Yeah, so this is where I think as an employee or a faculty, we need to work with our immediate manager, supervisor, and tell them and keep them in the loop about what actual work you are doing and how you are contributing. And the best way to do it is you keep a track of sort of writing down all the contributions you have made and keep a running sheet of it and share it with your supervisor on a periodic basis. And that way your immediate manager knows what you have really done and what things you have accomplished. So when time comes, you either get recommended for promotion, or at least he or she knows what you have actually contributed, rather than look at the gossips and the rumors and all those. So you need to put that aside and focus on your contributions and continue to add value by empowering others. Make use of your knowledge so others can benefit. And at the end, the titles do not matter much, because the titles come and go, but your knowledge is your treasure, which you want to build and continue to replenish your knowledge bank, and that keeps you young, right? If you do that well, you will be more satisfied, you will be more content, and don't look for just the titles, because titles are not the ultimate thing. Ultimate thing is what contributions have you made and what real impact you make for the rest of the people in the institute. That's what should be counting, and you should count that the most. And my sincere request is, we spent about hour and a half discussing some of the critical life skills issue about leadership. Whatever you learned today from this module, take few items and start implementing it. Once you implement, then the knowledge will be retained. If you don't implement, it's listening and then forgetting, and you will go to the next topic. So that's my sincere request. And I want to thank Shilpi ji for moderating the session, Dr. Kiran ji for my special gratitude for allowing me to be part of your FDP. So thank you very much. And if there is any closing comment, you can go ahead and get that thing done.
Thank you so much, sir, for such a enlightening and informative session, and for taking out time from your busy schedule to be part of this FDP. I know it's really late for you, and at such an odd hour, you have managed to be with us. And it's a matter of great privilege and honor for us to have you with us. And it means a lot, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Shilpi ji. Thank you all. And have a wonderful session and a great learning at the FDP. So bye, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye.
Dear participants, we will be taking a short break. I request all of you to log in by 11:25 for the second session by Dr. Amrita Sen, Assistant Professor, IIT Kharagpur. Thank you so much. See you at 11:25 a.m. Thank you, everyone. Good morning and welcome back to the second half of the FDP. Our second speaker for today is Dr. Amrita Sen. Before we begin, with this session, dear participants, please note that the session will be for 1 hour, followed by the Q&A session, Q&A for half an hour. Please post your questions in the chat box and also keep your videos on throughout the sessions. Videos for all the sessions will be available on the CMS YouTube channel. The link for the same has been posted. Thank you. Dr. Amrita Sen is Dr. Amrita Sen is an assistant professor of sociology at Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, and a visiting faculty in Azim Premji University. Her research interests include cultural and political ecology, politics of forest conservation, urban environmental conflicts, and Anthropocene studies. In 2019, Amrita received the Excellence in PhD Thesis Award from Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, for her doctoral research on the conservation politics in Sundarbans. She has also received grants from Indian Council of Social Science Research and European Network of Political Ecology towards her research on the Sundarbans. With honor and respect, I welcome Dr. Amrita Sen to address the participants and attendees. Ma'am will be speaking on the topic industry-oriented pedagogic methods in social sciences. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So this is Amrita. I'm based out of IIT Kharagpur. I'm a sociologist by training, and I primarily work on environmental sociology and cultural politics around natural resources. So as you can see, drawing on largely my background is in sociology, and I presume many of you have interest in humanities and social sciences. So before directly going on to my specific topic, the topic of discussion for today that I would like to discuss with all of you, I would be very interested to ask some of you if you have any idea about what sociology is. So if any of you, maybe if 3 or 4 of you can just roughly give me a brief idea on what you understand by the term sociology, it would be better to pitch the discussion for today. Any rough guess of what sociology is or what the subject concerns itself with? Yes, I can see Dr. Ranjit Yadav raising his hand. So would you kindly go ahead? Okay, social interaction. Yeah, I think it is one of the major components of sociology, because what we do in sociology, I would also be talking about sociological imagination.
Deals with how people interact or study how the people are interacting or how they are behaving in a group.
Yes, yeah. So it is basically a scientific study of society. We tend to study a lot of things that are related to the society, the social organization, and the social order. So I get another very interesting response that sociology is the scientific study of society, including patterns of social relationships, social interaction, and culture. I think this is a very, very comprehensive definition of sociology, and I'm really glad to see this. Another response, study of social life, social behavior. So exactly so. So what we would be doing today, I do not know how much I would be able to cover the industry-oriented methods, but I would definitely be talking about social science research methods and the pedagogic methods. So to say, so one of the most essential components that we would be discussing today is about social organizations, is about social interactions, how people behave in a society, how people interact with each other, and most importantly, as sociologists, as social scientists, what kind of imagination we should have so that we can make a sense of these interactions, so that we can make a sense of these observations, so that we can make a sense of the society itself. So I think that for for beginners, or rather for any person interested to study society, it is an imperative to begin with the methods that we use in understanding society. That is extremely important. And as you would be knowing, many of you would be knowing that since the subject is largely descriptive, it is largely exploratory because it studies human societies, we tend to employ methods which are largely qualitative in nature. Qualitative in the sense it's broad, it's analytical, it's descriptive, it's explanatory, and it asks questions like how, like what, like when. So in most of the cases, when we study sociology, when we try to do sociological research, when we try to explore any specific discrete aspect of the society, what we do essentially is that we ask these three questions. It is an imperative, it is integral to ask these three questions: the when, what, and how question, the descriptive, the exploratory, and the explanatory part of research that leads us to collect data from a setting which is not controlled, which is not a laboratory. Always remember that a society is a setting which is not a controlled environment. It is not like a laboratory. It's not like a specific experiment. So society keeps on changing. Society keeps on evolving. If I get time, I would also be doing some of the basic classical theories of sociology in order to give you an understanding of why I say so, that societies are evolving, societies are changing, societies are dynamic. So for instance, the kind of societies that we are living in today would be very different from the kind of societies that would exist 100 years down the line. So it is very important for a social science researcher to be qualitatively perceptive, to study in every minute detail the very, very dynamic nature of society. What is the reason why individuals behave in a specific way? What is the reason why individuals prefer certain kinds of things in a society? So for instance, I will give you one very basic example that I often give to my students. So if you see a person drinking coffee, for instance, apparently it might seem to be a very, very mundane physical act of drinking coffee. But we as sociologists try to study the context. We as sociologists try to study the situation where these two people are having coffee. So what is it that makes them sit together and have the coffee? There might be different kinds of reasons. They might want to socialize. They might want to discuss their problems. They might want to open up. They might have met after a very long period of time. So reasons vary. So we have to be, this is a very basic example that a mere physical act of having coffee can be interpreted in very, very different ways by a sociologist. And I think this is the strength of the subject. The ability of the researcher to have multiple dimensions, multiple analytical dimensions of the same situation being studied. So I think I will now start with what I want to discuss today. I would just give me some time to share the PPT. So is the screen visible? Can you see the screen? Can you see the screen? Okay, yeah. Yeah. So, we would try to look into some of the pedagogic methods in social sciences. And so, as I was saying, that sociology provides us with an understanding, with a very broad understanding of a social context. What a social context looks like, who are the actors within that social context. Now, having said that, it is also very important to know that since we study social order, since we study society in such depth, the pedagogic method that is involved in sociology is very different from the quantitative subjects that we study. So one of the major imperatives for us, for example, is to explore the implications of various social theories for the process of teaching and learning. So let me begin by saying this, that sociology is an extremely theory heavy language, is an extremely heavy theoretically oriented subject. And that theory has to be essentially integrated within teaching and within learning. So, for instance, if you do not have a conceptual idea of what you are studying about, if you do not read in sufficient detail, sufficient subjectivity of what you are studying about, what you would be researching on, it would not be easy for you to explore a field situation, to explore the dynamics of a field. And also, let me remind you that in many cases, you would see that we as sociologists study situations which are often very difficult to study. So, for instance, think about a person, think about a researcher who is trying to study the caste system in a very, very remote village, maybe of India, maybe in North India, maybe in South India. So, the entry points to these kinds of researchers who study gender, researchers who study class, who study caste, people who study different kinds of social problems. So essentially, these kinds of issues, they are often very complex, they are often very sensitive, they are not easy to explore. So what kind of things? So when you would be teaching your students about exploring the society, when you would be prompting your students to learn about the society, how would you pitch the sociological context? What would be the beginning principle of that particular pedagogy? So initially, I feel as a practitioner of sociology that you should start with some good classical theories. Theories which have explored these concepts before. Theories which have a very strong empirical content, which had allowed them to arrive at very strong conceptual dimensions. And that conceptual dimension translates into sociological knowledge, translates into that particular expertise which leads us to address the social dynamics of any particular society. So we can say that if we employ sociology as a pedagogy, it can be a model which encourages us to use our own imagination, our sociological imagination. I will come to the difference between common sense imagination and sociological imagination later on. But sociology as a pedagogical model encourages us to use our sociological imagination, our sociological knowledge to reflect on and to address these social dynamics. So I will give you one example to make it easier for you. So I am an environmental sociologist. I'm an environmental anthropologist. So I had the opportunity of spending a lot of time during my PhD in a very, very remote village of India, situated in the Ganga Brahmaputra Delta, the Sundarban region. So we all know that Sundarbans is one of the global biodiversity hotspots in the world. But one question that I started my research with was, what is the need of doing this research? What is the need of integrating environment as an aspect within sociology? So it was during this period of time when I was starting my PhD and when I was starting to ask different questions, which essentially allowed me to relate society to environment. One of the main things that came to my mind after doing a lot of literature review, after reading a lot of material, after attending different classes on ecology and society, one thing I felt was that there is a larger gap in addressing the social when we speak about the ecological. So when we speak about the environment, we talk about different kinds of things. We talk about sea level rise, we talk about climate change, we talk about pollution, we talk about degradation of water bodies. But we very rarely talk about people who are subjected within that particular environment. So how climate change affects the rich and the poor very differently. How air pollution impacts people like scavengers, people who do not have any formal settlements. How pollution impacts these people, how pollution of water, degradation of environment impacts different people very differently. So very recently, we had been doing one research on environmental racism, which actually allowed us to think about casteism and racism as a part of these environmental agendas. So for instance, when we are talking about waste disposal, when we are going several kilometers away from the city and trying to dispose our wastes, are we really doing anything sustainable? Or are we actually endangering the lives and the livelihoods of the people who are staying in the countryside? So different kinds of, I again had some opportunity to visit these kinds of countryside spaces where landfill sites are located. And let me remind you that many of these countryside spaces had been very, very vibrant ecological landscapes with communities having distinct livelihood patterns. Now, when a landfill comes up in an illegal and unsustainable way, very near to a community habitation in the countryside, it completely jeopardizes their living, their livelihood, and leads to large-scale repercussions. So the reason why I gave you all these examples is to constantly connect pedagogy with concepts, with previous understanding. So these kinds of examples that I'm trying to give you is with an intent to think deeper into social issues and integrate them within teaching methods, talking about your own experiences, talking about what happened in the past, talking about established truths in the society, talking about proven empirical cases. And that definitely enriches the learning experience for the students. So again, I would like to reiterate the same thing, that sociology is not a subject where we simply enter a laboratory, where we simply enter a controlled environment, we run certain kinds of regression, we do certain kinds of modeling. No, but we open ourselves up to the people, we learn from them, we build our own inductive models, that is our own understanding, we employ our own sociological imagination, and we arrive at certain conceptual dimensions, we arrive at certain theories. So in most of the cases, when people want to connect their teaching and research, again, this is extremely important for us as sociologists, our research informs our teaching. And we largely try to incorporate this scholarship into the curriculum, this research-based scholarship into the curriculum. And once this is done effectively, this helps the students to gain a first-hand appreciation of the methods and findings of a professional sociologist, And this is extremely important, using sociological ideas to inform our pedagogy. It is very effective. And I would say that it is also relatively underutilized. We do not find this kind of research-oriented pedagogy a lot when we do an integrated teaching in sociology. But I would like to advise that as a professional sociologist, as a person who is practicing the subject for the last 10 to 12 years now, or even more than that, I find it the most effective when you draw your teaching lessons, when you draw your curriculum directly from your research and from a very well developed body of literature. It is extremely important. So as I was saying, that the content of the subject area includes a very broad understanding of human interaction with the natural and the social environment across time, across space, across institutions. There are also different other aspects to it. So till now, I was largely talking about the need to integrate first-hand values, first-hand experience into the curriculum of sociology, into the pedagogy itself, which makes the learning experience, the teaching experience much more effective and much more rewarding. But there are certain other aspects to it that we need to learn when we talk about pedagogical methods in sociology. One thing that we are taught as sociologists in few of the very beginning parts of our training, sociological training, is that a sociologist, as a researcher, as a teacher, has to be value free, has to be free of all kinds of bias. But it is an essential duty, it is a prerogative of a sociologist to promote human values so that we can resist different kinds of dogma. We can resist racism. We can resist binaries. And how do we do that? So it's always very easy saying, but how do we ensure that we preach freedom? We promote trust and respect for diversity. And how do we ensure that doing so, promoting human values like freedom, trust, and respect for diversity, enhances learners' ability to critically reflect on social issues, having a bearing on individual and social well-being? This is a very, very important part, I feel, that our duty as instructors, as teachers, does not only remain confined to coming in a class and talking about theories and research and just going away. No. But we need to inculcate this same sense of values, freedom, trust, and respect in an effective way within the classroom environment, so that the learner's ability to grasp different kinds of issues, different kinds of social issues, translates into their well-being. At no point our delivery or our instructions, as I was saying, at no point we should make apparent that we have inherent bias, that the content that we are delivering has an inherent racist aspect, has aspects of hierarchy, entrenches aspects of social hierarchy. Our students might come from different backgrounds, and the pedagogy needs to be designed in such a way that we include within the curriculum issues, subjects, theories from very, very versatile contexts that appeals to students, to each and every student very effectively. And doing so, trust me, would inculcate values like empathy, like equality, like liberty, like justice, like fraternity, dignity, plurality, and harmony. Because for instance, when I start my classes every semester, I always tend to say my students at the very first lecture, I tell them that this is not a one-way lecture. This is not a monologue. This is a discussion class. This is a round table where we would be discussing certain issues together. It is not a one-way dialogue that I come to the class, I teach you certain things, you ask me some questions, and that's it. No. But it is a kind of discussion which would promote individual opinions, even if they are at conflict with me, that does not matter. But it should, so arranging or organizing a class in such a way would definitely show a respect for diversity that you need within your basic pedagogy. You need to include opinions and perceptions, perspectives of the very, very diverse learners batch that you have. That is very important. So every discipline in social sciences has its own method of investigation for arriving at conclusions through understanding, through analyzing, evaluating, and applying a logical and a rational approach to understand the cause and effect relationship of events, processes, and phenomena. So as I was saying in the beginning, that we often, and in most of the cases, we tend to employ descriptive qualitative methods, because in most of the cases what we do is that we study humans, we study social processes. But the method of investigation is very different. So for instance, a person who is studying remote areas, a person who wants to study maybe a tribal community, for instance, might want to indulge himself or herself in an ethnography. What is an ethnography? So you must have heard about scholars and researchers who stay with the community for a very long period of time, maybe for 2 years, maybe for 3 years, and learn from them and learn from their societies. And then they come back and they write their own dissertation, they write their own books, they publish articles and things like that. But there are very different ways of investigation. These methods of investigation are actually evolving nowadays. There are also researchers who spend time with the communities for a relatively shorter period of time. They do different kinds of things. They record community experiences. They do different kinds of podcasts. They feature different kinds of films where people talk about their own experiences. So the method of arriving at conclusions might be very different, and it might vary from a researcher to researcher on how that particular researcher is analyzing the data, is evaluating the data, is applying an approach, a logical approach or a rational approach to the kind of data that he or she has gathered. But irrespective of any method of investigation that we use, we tend to keep in mind certain things, that we have to be biased, we have to be free from any bias, we have to be value free, we have to promote justice, and we have to have an element of empathy. That we are not doing any favor by studying a community, but we are trying to learn from them so that we can pass on this learning experience effectively when we teach in the class. And these methods, so there is often a discourse going on, and I would not say going on, but this discourse had been there for a very long period of time, that sociologists, the kind of inquiry that a sociologist does is not scientific, which is, I feel, which is very wrong. Social science do lend themselves to methods of scientific inquiry which might be distinct from the natural and physical sciences, but they have their own objectivity. They have their own precision. So the research that I do today, maybe on the Sundarbans, might not be replicated. It is not easy to replicate that research. Even if it is a sociological research, even if it is descriptive, it is not easy to replicate any research, so to say. So for example, many people before me might have done an anthropological work on Sundarban, sociological inquiries on Sundarban. But what is the uniqueness of my work? If so many studies had already been done on the sociological and anthropological contexts on the Sundarbans, or for that matter, any particular area, why am I again doing a study? Why am I again asking certain questions in that same field? So there must be certain uniqueness. There must be certain elements or certain questions which are new, which are fresh, which are actually leading the inquiry that I propose in this particular work. So I would now directly come to some of the methods and pedagogy that is used in social science inquiry. So I think this is again something which we discussed in bits and pieces so far in the discussion, that this is a subject where information is largely sought on opinions, on attitudes, on views, on beliefs, on preferences. It is very, very flexible. And these variables can be isolated, they can be defined. And another thing that I would want to point out at this stage is that in most of the cases, so if you look into the larger sociological research, it is very important for us to know that we always do not have a very large unit of analysis, but we tend to have small group discussions. So in many cases, you would be seeing that sociologists and anthropologists are studying a very small neighborhood. They may be doing their field work in a very small village, which comprises of 200 to 300 households. Or they might be involving themselves in very, very small, discrete group discussions. So for us, the size is not that important. It is not essential that we always go to the field in order to generate data for our work. We go to the field and we do thousands of surveys. It's not essential. But what is essential is to go in depth. Even if you are talking to one person in the entire day, you have to make sure that you are having a very, very in-depth and detailed discussion with that person. That is important. You need to have information. You need to explore as much as you can qualitatively. This is the uniqueness about qualitative research, that exploring in depth about humans, about communities, about societies. So we often do small group discussions for investigating beliefs, attitudes, and different concepts of normative behavior. So you must have heard about this term semi-structured interviews. So we do not always go to the field with a very, very fixed schedule of questions, but we tend to navigate our questions in very different ways depending upon the flow of the observations, depending upon the flow of the conversations. So in many circumstances, it might happen that we have to tweak our questions. We have to change our questions. So we keep it semi-structured so that we can seek views on a focused topic with the key informants. And it is also very important that we have some background information, some institutional perspective. As I was talking, that it is not only sufficient if you just go to the field and start interviewing people, because that is merely what a journalist does. So then what is it? What is the difference between a sociological researcher and journalist? The difference is that you need to have a proper literature review. You need to have a proper sense of the literature, which would enrich the study, which would allow you to analyze the study in an effective way and deliver that effectively when you pass on that lesson to the students in the class. So it is very important that we do in-depth interviews to understand conditions, experiences, events from a personal perspective. In many cases, we analyze texts and documents like government reports, media articles, websites, diaries. And why we do so? Because it is very important to learn about distributed and private knowledge. You will see social scientists complementing their field data with proper archival data as well. So I think I have some questions. Would you mind if I take them at the end? Thank you. So it is very important. You would often see that social scientists, apart from their field research and side by side their field research, they would also have to do literary analysis to a large extent, visiting different government departments, analyzing government reports, analyzing media articles, analyzing different websites, going to archives, consulting the previous histories, oral narratives, mythologies. These kinds of things are extremely important to complement the first-hand data that you gather from the field. And another thing that is also very important, so when you embark on a research which is social science oriented, which is sociological, I would like to alert you about the fact that almost always you need to have a proper question in mind. Now, how would you, so many a times my students ask me that, ma'am, what kind of questions should we ask? I think this is a very important question in itself, I would say. This is a very important question of how to raise a question in sociology. Now, there are different ways of answering this, but one thing that I feel is very effective in terms of raising a question, or maybe 2 or 3 questions when you embark on your research, is to find out the gaps in the existing literature. So for instance, if you are studying urban sociology, I'm just giving you an example. If you are studying cities, if you are studying urban growth in a particular town, in a particular city, you must have read articles, you must have read different books, you must have done a very thorough literature. Now, while studying all these literature that you have in hand, you must have felt that there is a certain gap which has still not been addressed. Definitely, you should feel that gap, because if you are not feeling that gap, then actually there is no point in duplicating a study. You should feel that gap, and you would it is actually easier to look into the scope of every study. So every book or every well-written journal article will point out future scope of study. That is, I think, a very, very important part of academic exercise, pointing out scope or future, the scope for future work. So that is where lies your question. That is where lies the continuity. So this is this very gap that you identify by doing a literature review. The very scope that you identify after reading a journal article prompts you to ask certain questions. So in many cases, in social sciences, we do not have a hypothesis, but a question or more than one questions, 2 or 3 questions replaces the hypothesis. And once we have questions, we systematically proceed to use a set of procedures to answer those questions. And how is it done? In most of the cases, it is done inductively. We collect evidence. We try to conceptually analyze that evidence using, as I was saying, using our own sociological imagination. And we create or we add to the existing knowledge system. So these kinds of findings that we produce in sociology are not determined in advance. These findings are applicable beyond the immediate boundaries of the study. And why are they not determined in advance? As I was saying, because society keeps on changing. So the conclusions or the analysis or the data that you derive from studying a tribal village today would be very different if I study the same village after 20 years. It seeks to understand a given research problem or a topic from the perspectives of the local population it involves. You need to keep this in mind. Just try to pin this in your mind that learning from the perspectives of the local population is an extremely important part of the pedagogical exercise in sociology. You need to learn from the community itself. And this type of research is especially effective in obtaining culturally specific information about values, about opinions, about behaviors, about social contexts of particular people. Now, many people ask me about the strength of qualitative research. I would like to spend some time saying about that. So, often there are critiques that qualitative research is not valid because it lacks reliability. Now, I would provide a strong counterpoint to that. I feel that the strength of qualitative research, the validity of qualitative research, lies in its ability to provide complex textual descriptions of how people experience a given research issue. Again, I would like to remind you that it is the kinds of fields that we navigate, studying gender problems, maybe studying crimes against women, studying caste issues, studying issues like honor killing, studying tribal conflicts, studying urban environments. So these are not fields which are very easy to navigate. So the researcher has to develop that skill to acquaint himself or herself with the population at the very first place. How do you make yourself a part of a community? And why would that community, out of all reasons, allow you to be a part of themselves? So doing this is not a very easy exercise. But once you can do this effectively, you would be able to provide a very, very comprehensive picture of complex realities. And I feel this is the strength and this is the uniqueness of qualitative research. In that, it provides information about human sides of an issue, often contradictory behaviors, beliefs, opinions, emotions, relationships of individuals. And these methods are most effective in identifying numerous intangible factors like social norms, like socioeconomic status, like gender roles, like ethnicity, like religion. And let me again reiterate that the roles of these factors might not be readily apparent. You might not be able to make a sense of any of these intangible factors if you plan to go to a field, just do a survey for one day and come back and try to analyze that. Absolutely not. You need to be an engaged participant, observer in that particular field in order to make a sense of these intangible conditions around that particular social context. And doing that would help to interpret and better understand the complex reality of a given situation. So, qualitative research essentially seeks depth rather than breadth. As I was saying, that it is not numbers that is important for us. So instead of drawing from a large representative sample of an entire population of interest, qualitative researchers seek to acquire in-depth and intimate information about an essentially small group of people. And the ultimate aim is to learn about how, as I was telling you about these three questions, how, why, what. So our aim is to learn about how and why people behave, think, and make meaning as they do certain things, rather than always focusing on what people are doing. And these goals, the goals of qualitative research, can be situated on several levels. So, having said about that, so why I discussed about the methods in such detail is because I envision methods to be a very important part of the pedagogy itself. So for the learners, it is very important to know how an instructor or how a teacher arrives at certain kinds of knowledge. It is very important for a learner to know, as maybe studying students or maybe understanding a bit about students' perspectives, I think a lot of questions from the students about theories, about empirical data, about the kinds of case studies that we share with them comes from their anxiety or their quest to know about the ways in which we arrive at these content and the reasons why we are discussing that particular content. So that is why if we have a very good grip on the methods in social sciences, it is essentially easier for us to communicate effectively about the need of teaching a particular subject, a particular theme, a particular module in a curriculum much more effectively. So there are several pillars in pedagogy, as you can see here. I have drawn this from somewhere else. I found this very effective. So one is alignment. We need, as I was saying this repetitively, that we need to identify prior knowledge. We need to identify the literature base. And doing that aligns teaching to intended outcomes. It provides opportunities to revisit learning. And then connection. It is very important to make connections, drawing on relevant content. So often something that we, it happens very frequently that we fail to connect the lesson with a case that we want, with an empirical content that we want to project. So we need to be specific about ensuring inclusive content, drawing on relevant content. Inclusivity is extremely important. I repeat, you should not have a sense of bias. There should not be any reflection of a sense of bias, prejudice, or any kind of personal opinions, values when you teach a particular subject, specifically more so in social sciences. Because in social sciences, in sociology and anthropology, we do topics which are relatively sensitive. Then community, establishing productive learning relationships, Promoting dialogue, very important. So a class should not be a monologue. A class should be a dialogue. It should be a discussion. It is important to share power with students. Students should not feel that an instructor is all powerful. We would never be able to question the instructor because we have an uncomfortable question, a question that conflicts with what is being taught in the class. So it is very important to take counter opinions from the students, even if they are conflicting with our worldviews. I think that is again something which makes pedagogy extremely effective. Then, maximizing student interest, meeting diverse motivational needs. So different students might have different kinds of motivations for studying a particular topic or a particular subject. So we need to see how we can maximize their interests, maybe by showing graphics, maybe by representing the course content in a very different way, maybe by making very lively discussions, maybe by promoting a kind of exchange within the students themselves. So there can be a variety of activities. And last but not the least, we need to remember that more than a job, teaching itself is an inquiry. So similar to the fact that we learn from our respondents in the field, we learn from people in the field, we need to remember that we also need to learn from our students. I have seen this, I can tell you from my own experience, the kinds of questions that students come up with in a class often lead us to revisit the content, to think in a very different way, to include content or to include dimensions that we had not thought about earlier. So we need to keep this in mind, that teaching is a very, very important part of inquiry. So learners make a sense of new information by relating it to concepts and ideas stored in their long-term memory. All of you must have seen this, that students in the class try to connect their past knowledge. So for instance, if something is being discussed in the class, and if they feel that they know about that from their past experiences, from their memory, they will try to relate to that through a complex process of selecting, sorting, and integrating it with prior knowledge. And this is a very important part of the sense making. So being teachers, it is essential to identify and understand what this prior knowledge of the students is, and the particular groups of students who possess this knowledge. Using research-based information about how students progress in terms of conceptual understanding and skills, again, very important. Consider whether the techniques use emphasized recognition or recall. Use understandings of what students know when designing tasks so that students are not inadvertently subjected to embarrassment. So when you are designing any kind of task or deliverable, keep in mind that there are students from all sections of a society. So that particular task should benefit them all, rather than making the situation difficult for any one of them, or maybe for more than one of them. We need to keep that in mind. So according to Kathy Swan, there are 4 principal themes of social science pedagogy: research, reflection, learning, reading. Research, I think we have discussed in very, very detail here, that students will be given the opportunity to review, analyze, discuss, and apply research from diverse perspectives in education. It is very important. So you have done in many cases, what we do is that we think that we have done a lot of research and we just need to bombard the students with that. But that is not the aim of pedagogy. You need to indulge the students in their own research. So give them papers, ask them to review, ask them to analyze, take them to fields, allow them to discuss. Try to apply their bent of research mind. And this is when they will be able to reflect on their own capacities and practices. As they study, they observe and practice in the classroom with their cooperating teachers. This is very important. Reflection. How do we ensure that students are reflecting on what they are studying? So try to ask them to produce written materials. Always remember, I believe this very much, that writing is a far better communication tool than speaking. Students might say very different, very interesting, very dynamic things in the class, but when it comes to writing, they often fail. We have seen this as teachers. So it is our duty to inculcate this practice of writing essays as a part of reflection. Critical observations about contemporary issues, about teaching experiences, to help them fully utilize their analytical and problem-solving skills needed to become a good teacher. Coming to learning, every student should be passionate about their commitment to equip themselves for lifelong learning as future educators. And it is a duty to equip students to be lifelong learners. So we appreciate, we all know, being teachers, it is a difficult task, because in most of the cases we have seen that students learn with the purpose of doing good in the examination, and once the examination is over, they tend to just they do not remember in most of the cases what is being taught. So I think it is better to be in touch with the students. Maybe in most of the institutes we now have different kinds of continuing projects and things like that that we can offer to the students, so that they have a practical grasp on what had been taught in the class before, maybe in the previous semesters. And also about leading, that the students will actively lead in their schools, serve as models on excellent pedagogical skills. So I remember we organized one symposium for the American Association for the Geographers, where we tried to look into what academic social responsibility is. As educators, as trainers, what kind of responsibility do we have? Especially in today's scenario, where we see a lot of social problems, we see a lot of challenges, we see different kinds of hierarchies. So there had been 5 things that we actually came up with, and that is something we thought would allow a lot of change in the ways in which we teach, we try to impart our lessons. And these are respectful and inclusive pedagogy, collaborative theory building, giving back to the society, plurality of interests. If not us, then who? Try to think over. So these 5 factors, or these 5 things that has been pointed out here as a part of our academic social responsibility in the present decade, which is full of different kinds of problems, social unrest, environmental issues, different kinds of things. How can we contribute to the students, to the society more effectively as instructors? I think reflecting a bit upon these 5 points would provide us with some opportunity. So I would end with one last theory, as we were talking about theories in the beginning of this lecture. And also I was talking about the need of good theory in order to grasp different social issues, different complex social issues. So there was one sociologist, Professor C. Wright Mills, who coined this term sociological imagination. drawing on different ethical theories. And so what is sociological imagination, and how is this sociological imagination different from a commonplace imagination? So what he says is that this sociological imagination is an ability to see social problems that influence individuals, families, groups, and organizations, and act to make connections between complexities arising out of different social forces. So I think a major task that belies upon us is the fact that we do not only imagine about a complexity in hand, but the ability to visualize the social problems that are associated with these complex social situations. As I was talking about the need to revisit our academic social responsibility, keeping in mind these challenging times, I feel that the most and the best effectiveness of sociological imagination is this specific recognition of the complex social problems that can emanate through the changing societies, through the ways in which societies are continuously evolving, and making a sense of that. How would these social problems manifest upon individuals in the coming days? And this is something that we need to collectively work upon. This is not sociological imagination, or thinking about that is not a one-day task. It requires a deeper and a protracted engagement across the teaching community, across the community of the instructors. And this is when we would be able to think about education, about pedagogy as a common good. We would be effectively, much more effectively, think about academic social responsibility in a justified and effective way. So I think I will end here, and thank you so much. And I would like to have some questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We'll take up questions. Participants, if you would like to ask questions, you can raise your hand, or you can post your questions in the chat box. Ma'am, there's one question which is asked by Mr. Rama Krishnan, and he asked, what are the factors that motivate teachers and students to experience from the field and bring the learnings for the discussion?
Yeah, I think this is a very important and a very interesting question. So, as I was talking in the beginning of this lecture about the need to learn directly from our field experiences. So, what motivates a learner or a teacher to learn from these field experiences? So, I will give you an example. Suppose if you have taught a few theories, theoretical ideas, conceptual ideas in the class, and then you go ahead and you discuss some of the first-hand experiences that you had in a field. So I can give you one example about the field that I explored. So for instance, the Sundarbans, where I had worked for some time. So I was teaching this course on ecology and society, where we talk about the fact that there are a lot of communities, for instance, the tribal communities, indigenous communities, who depend upon environment in different kinds of ways. They are dependent on natural resources. They depend on fuel wood. They depend on different other products from the forest, like honey, like other fruits and different minor forest produce and things like that. And the dependence on these resources is very different in the global south, in the places where we live. So for instance, in India, we see that a large number of communities essentially reside close to these areas like the forests, like the resource-rich mountains. We all know about the Niyamgiri, the Vedanta conflict, for instance. So it is one thing that you teach the students about the fact that communities in the global south are very, very dependent on the resources, very much so. The resource dependence of the communities on the global south is very different from the global north. This is something that you teach in the class. But when you sort of try to bring examples directly from your field, so for instance, in the Sundarbans, we find that a lot of people in their everyday struggle to go inside the forests to fetch minor forest produce, to fetch honey, to fetch wax, they do not only struggle against the state, but they also risk their lives. We all know that the Sundarbans are the largest territory of the Royal Bengal tiger. So a lot of people every year essentially risk their lives to the tigers in order to procure their livelihoods. So I feel that it is always this connect between what you teach theoretically in the class and what you bring in examples in the form of empirics. This very connect makes it interesting for both the teachers and the learners. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, ma'am. Ms. Pinu Jose would like to ask you a question. I'll unmute her. Ma'am, you can ask.
Hi, good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you for that deep and relevant presentation. My question is more about a more generic one, because I think in my exposure to sociologists, there's so much of deep insights is given always. Then why in this pandemic didn't we give importance to sociologists as equally as epidemiologists or immunologists? So that's one current question, that why didn't we look at you, because you know why people don't wear masks, you know why people want to gather, and yet we did not have so much of sociologists helping people devise policies or make governance better and compassionate. That's question number one. Second is, I know that there is a lot of us on this call who are more business management engineering, because it's AICT driven, and our bias against sociologists is what actually prevents us from getting out into the community to do some research, and relevant giving back to the society doesn't happen because we want quick results. That's why we go for quantitative more than qualitative research. So what do you think are tips that we could use in our classes in management and engineering that could help us to give this as a tool and as a medium for our students to take forward, whether they are entrepreneurs or whether they are corporate, businessmen or men and women? What can they make out of the studies that they take from here, whether it is engineering or management? I know that was too long, but did I complicate things?
No, I think I would take your the first question, and if I still remember the second, then it's fine. Otherwise, I will ask you again.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah. So one thing regarding this COVID question that you asked, right? So I would not be able to answer this question very effectively because I'm not a policymaker, I'm an academic. But something that there has been an overwhelming literature coming up from the COVID studies, and specifically the need to address cities or understand cities in a very different way. Specifically, I can tell you about Nature as a journal. You must have heard about it. Nature publishes very, very strong and academic articles on every social and scientific issue. So one article I remember I was reading in this specific magazine, which says that one thing is, so we have seen a lot of networking, cities networking with each other in order to build up their respective recovery task force and things like that. But what the main point of critique that it raises is that these kinds of initiatives, the structural initiatives, are definitely welcome, like building networks, building more and more safe homes, and designing COVID infrastructures. These kinds of things are definitely welcome. But what we also need to think about is the ways in which cities govern and the ways in which they run. So if, for instance, if we talk a lot about networking, we talked a lot about networking as a response to this pandemic situation, ways to empower communities. But there had been very little discussion ever since the pandemic had taken off. There had been a very little discussion on ways in which we can communicate among ourselves. So, for instance, how different places can source more food, how they can source more relief materials. We all have known about the migrant crisis and the complete failure of the government to address the crisis of the migrants in the situation. So how we can prioritize basic resources to an extent that we build up a major stock in order to address these kinds of issues in future. So what is the employment pattern, for instance, of the migrants? So why did the migrants end up in such a situation that they had to abruptly leave for their homes? So there are different kinds of things that if so, for instance, there is also a social legal aspect that we talk about, that if we need to have a stronger leadership, a stronger governance at different levels, and if we need to ensure rapid responses, then how can we look up to other cities? So for instance, the cities like Hanoi in Vietnam, which fared so well after the major outbreak. So how can we learn? What kind of techniques have they been using in order to arrest the rapid spread of the virus in the initial period? Then our own cities like Trivandrum. So what have been, so learning from each other, that is something I think has been time and again been raised in these journals like Nature. And also another thing that I feel had been lacking to a large extent had been how to address the confusion, reliability of data, reliability of information. What kind of information is made available? What is the genuineness of that information? So, for instance, you talked about social distance, you talked about masks, but I feel that individuals have to know first that why they should maintain social distance, why they should wear masks in a particular way. So maybe publishing dashboards, publishing periodicals in a way that preaches or that brings out the effectivity of these kinds of good practices to the common people generally, who can understand this and then interpret them within their own actions. I think this is my response to your first question. And what was your second question? Sorry, I just lost a track of it.
Yeah, thank you. So my second question was about how engineering and management programs can address these issues of qualitative component in because not all of them are going to be social entrepreneurs, not all of our students are going to look at research as the medium, but during the 3 years, 4 years that they are with us, how do we inculcate the discipline of qualitative philosophy of qualitative thinking? That's something that I had a doubt about.
Yes. So I would not be able to tell you about management students, but I can give you some ideas because I essentially teach undergraduate, like engineer undergraduate students. So one thing that I have seen for a fact is that students always prefer and they always try to learn from communications, even if they're qualitative. Qualitative essentially more because they are not so much exposed to qualitative methods in their own classes. They get to know a lot about quantitative, but they do not get to know about qualitative. So for instance, when I teach about smart cities and the different loopholes within the policy mission itself, I think smart city is learning about smart city missions from a sociological, from a political perspective is something which is taken very well by these students, because many of them would they contemplate careers as planners. So they often ask very interesting questions, that how can we ensure, so for instance, when we are implementing a particular mission in a particular city, how can we ensure that people come forward, they come with their problems, they come with the issues that they want to incorporate within this particular mission. So one effective way of maybe teaching them about these policies, because a lot in right now what we do in many of the classes, we talk a lot about policies, like I speak about smart cities, then we also in classes we talk about these draft environmental impact assessments and topics like that, on which students have a lot of interest. So I think that something that they really prefer is a very strong and effective critique of these kinds of policies, so that they can learn from them. So our job as social scientists, as sociologists, is not to make new policies, but to see how effective a particular policy is, or if it is failing, what are the reasons why it is failing, what are the reasons that are coming up from the public, which they feel might be particular reasons why a definite policy is failing. So I think that having a good communication class where we can discuss these lacunas, where we can discuss these loopholes about the policies, where we can discuss about these critiques that comes up from the public forum, actually makes it a very effective discussion.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for such an elaborate answer. We'll take up the next question from Mr. Arasu. So you can unmute you can ask your question.
Thank you, madam. It's a very nice, interesting session. I ask only a simple question: how to cultivate the social importance and responsibility in young students' mind?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? How to cultivate?
Cultivate social importance and responsibility in young students' mind.
I got it. Yeah. So I think it is something that you need to explore with doing more classes, doing like maybe practical exercise with students. And as an example, I can tell you that I always prefer when I teach sensitive topics in class, like when I discuss about social problems, when I discuss about poverty, when I discuss about inequality in my own class, I always try to do at least a few components of practical exercise with them, so that they can directly go to these places and see how the communities are living, what kind of difficulties they are facing, so that they can themselves with their own eyes see the situation, visualize the problem, empathize with the community, and not only restricted to that, but also provide some kind of solutions or provide some kind of response in respect to that particular social problem. I think that increases the sensitivity of the students.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question will be from Dr. Morlin. So you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, ma'am, it was wonderful to listen to you and have a good insights. One of your slides you said about effective pedagogy in social sciences, where you mentioned about alignment and provide opportunities to revisit learning, right? When we teach, I am from a business school in St. Xavier's University, Kolkata. When we teach human resource management and performance appraisal, how do we integrate this revisit learning as a part of the curriculum so that they may understand what and how the method that you propose?
Again, like I would not be able to answer this very specifically to management studies, but again, I would like to reiterate that something that again I use in my own class. So when I teach a particular lesson, when I introduce a particular module, I just take it on a parallel basis, that for one class, I introduce a concept. For the very next 2 classes, I do case studies. For the 4th class, I do an application. So the method is you train the students about a concept, about variables. In the next classes, you allow them to visualize that concept through the case study that you give them. And in the subsequent class, you allow them to apply their own mind to solve problems. So this is how I work, and this is how, this is what I mean by an alignment and progressive learning, if that answers your question.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you. Ma'am, Mr. Shankar Prasad would like to ask you a question, so you can unmute yourself and ask.
Yes, thank you, Shilpi. Thank you very much, ma'am, for a wonderful session. Right now, as you see in metros, that there are more violence and women. And do you think the clash of urban and rural society would lead to all of this? I just want to know that if there is a clash of urban and rural society, especially which is constant right now in Indian metros, does it lead to any adversity as we actually see in the case of increase in violence on women?
Okay.
So this is my question.
So yeah, so specifically about, I do not know if the expansion of the urban and the peri-urban and the growing infringement of the rural into the peri-urban is related to increasing crimes on women, but I can say I can point out certain issues because I had been working on the peri-urban regions of certain cities for quite some time now, and I have seen very clearly in our own empirical exercise, we have actually seen that when a city extends its borders and sort of engulfs the suburbs, the existing rural areas, then there is not only pressures on the landscape, but there is altogether a very different sort of pressure on the resources, on the people, as well as on the governance. Because in many of these spaces, I have seen that because of a very hasty land development in the peri-urban areas, the governance system has become very confusing.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing that I think would partly answer your question is that, so for instance, in cities like Bangalore and Bombay, where I had stayed for quite some time, and these cities have in the recent years expanded a lot on their fringes. So what has happened is that in these peri-urban or suburban region, we see villages existing side by side with tall apartments. So it is a very unique mix of rural village and urban developments existing by side each other, existing parallel to each other. And naturally, the living system, the patterns of livelihood, everyday lives, the kinds of employment, the kinds of services that these people residing here are engaged in, it's very different and it's very contrasting for both the communities, for the urban community as well as for the rural community. Now, there have also been certain kinds of ethnic conflicts arising as a result of this, because we have seen that more and more people from cities, from other cities, so for instance, Bangalore, as many of us know, that in the recent years, there have been a lot of migration from other places. With the growing IT industries. So there have been, I have seen a lot of ethnic conflicts because very, very clearly the rural neighbors would not in all cases like their areas to be infringed by other people. And similarly, like very contrastingly, the urban dwellers or the urban people living in the tall and big apartments, they do not prefer slums and shanties near their spectacular apartments. So there is clearly a conflict situation here. I do not know if that elicits any kind of gender-based conflicts because I have not looked into that. But definitely certain kinds of inter-community conflicts exist that I can see and I can.
The reason why I asked this, ma'am, because if you know that 3 to 4 years before, Some of these metros were termed as rape capitals, and especially New Delhi in particular. And that was attributed to the cultural differences between the surrounding states to that of the metro. And I was wondering if that would result in the,
see, I would contrarily not use this term rape capital. I know that Delhi has a lot of, it has an increasing and comparatively large number of rape cases happening. But then if we look into the larger statistics, we can also see that other cities like Calcutta and Bombay, they are also not lagging behind in terms of gender crime.
Yes.
So I would not prefer, as a sociologist, I would not prefer to use the term rape capital. But I feel that the situation in Delhi and Bangalore is a little different, because in Delhi, especially like there is a large number of native population from the adjoining region who have very strong beliefs, and all of us know that they have a very different pattern of very different like sort of thinking about how the society should function. So they have very stringent roles and expectations from women and from men, and that leads to larger conflicts when they see that something very different is happening in the city of Delhi. So that might lead to violence again, violence against, crime against women. But in Bangalore, I feel to a certain extent the city is liberal in that way, because we find a lot of people coming from other cities like Bombay, Calcutta, who have come in search of jobs. So it's a very interesting amalgamation of people in the city itself. So I don't think that in terms of its regional specificities, the two cities can be compared. So Bangalore has its own set of problems, and Delhi has a very different set of problems.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, we'll take up the last question for the session. How do you think online classes and remote working is changing the social interaction in 20s and 30s age groups?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question. So we have been in our institute in IIT, we have been doing a lot of surveys, and we have been trying to take students' responses a lot in terms of this shift in teaching from offline to online. And so naturally students at a larger scale, they prefer classroom based teaching, and students as well as teachers, because that affords a much better and effective communication. We can see each other face to face and things like that. But contrarily, I also feel that the need of the hour is something to which we need to respond, and it is also required that we evolve ourselves responding to this need that we have now shifted to this online system of teaching. It has its own problems, it has its own limitations, like we cannot see students, many students do not tend to respond because they feel shy, they do not want to speak. So these kinds of things are there. But I have been teaching online courses for the last 3 semesters now, and for instance, in my case, what I do is that I pick up groups of students, maybe groups of 5 or 6, and try to interact personally with them on a periodic basis, so that I can keep a track of how they are performing or what their problems are, because we cannot expect that. So we teach classes of 100, 200 students. So we cannot expect that all of them would come and ask questions in an online setting. So many students they feel uncomfortable to ask questions in an online way. And then there are also other issues like connections, network problems and things like that. So it's much more effective as an instructor, I would say, that in a large pool of class, specifically in an online class, in a large pool of students, what you can do is that maybe you can break down the students into groups. Maybe you can do tutorials or projects or things like that, and assign different works to different groups, so that you can see. So for instance, if you have a group of 6 or 7 and you do a tutorial with them, then you will be able to see how each of them are doing more closely. You would be able to do that. So I think there is a lot of responsibility upon us. A lot of responsibility rests on us right now, being instructors, so that we make this online environment much more effective. for students coming from all kinds of backgrounds.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am, for being part of this conference and sharing your insights on how to understand society better. It was indeed a very highly informative and illuminating session. I'm sure we all got to learn a lot. It was a great honor to have you with us. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much for inviting me as well. Thank you.
Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
Now we will be taking a short lunch break. I request the participants to log in by 1:55 for the third session by Dr. Amrita Bharadwaj from Cardiff Business School, UK. Thank you, everyone. See you at 1:55 p.m.